For nearly 2,000 years, the fate of Rome's Ninth Legion has remained one of history's most haunting and enduring mysteries. A battle-hardened force of over 5,000 elite Roman soldiers marched into the fog-covered highlands of ancient Scotland, and then vanished without a trace. There were no mass graves, no battlefield reports, and no official accounts explaining what had happened to them. No survivors returned, no prisoners were recorded, and no trace of the Legion was ever found again. But what makes this story truly terrifying is not just that they disappeared. It is what the Roman Empire did next. A civilization obsessed with record-keeping, military pride, and legacy took deliberate steps to erase the Ninth Legion from existence. It was as if a powerful hand had reached into history itself and wiped their name from the record. This is not simply the story of a lost army swallowed by the unknown. This is the story of one of the most chilling cover-ups in the history of the Roman Empire. And to understand the scale of this mystery, we must first understand who these men truly were. The Ninth Legion was not an ordinary military unit. It was one of the most feared and respected forces in the entire Roman Empire. These men were forged in the brutal fires of civil war, where only the strongest and most disciplined soldiers survived. They marched under the command of Julius Caesar himself during some of the most grueling campaigns in Roman history. They were not inexperienced recruits or reluctant conscripts. They were elite shock troops trained for discipline, endurance, and relentless combat. Their strength was not just in numbers, but in their ability to endure unimaginable hardship and keep fighting. For nearly 2 centuries, the Ninth Legion served as the violent edge of Roman expansion, crushing rebellions across Spain. They held the dangerous frontiers of the empire, standing firm against relentless incursions from Germanic tribes. They stormed into Britain under the command of Claudius, bringing Roman power to a distant and hostile land, and they played a crucial role in crushing the massive uprising led by Boudicca. Time and time again, they were sent wherever the empire needed swift, decisive, and often brutal victories. By the early 2nd century AD, the Ninth Legion was stationed in northern Britain at a powerful fortress known as Eboracum. This fortress, in what is now modern York, stood as a symbol of Rome's absolute military dominance in the region. But beyond its northern walls lay a land that Rome could not control, the wild and unforgiving territory of Caledonia. This was a harsh land of dense forests, jagged highlands, and fiercely independent tribes who refused to submit to Roman rule. It was the perfect environment for ambush and guerrilla warfare, where Roman patrols often marched in but never returned. In the year 108 AD, we have clear and undeniable proof that the Ninth Legion was still alive and active in Britain. They were rebuilding and strengthening their fortress at Eboracum, working as a disciplined and organized force. An inscribed stone bearing their official name was carved and left behind, a simple record of their presence. At the time, it meant nothing more than a routine military dedication. But today, that stone stands as the final confirmed footprint of the Ninth Legion before the silence began. Because after that moment, something deeply unsettling happened. The highly detailed and obsessive Roman military records suddenly went completely silent. Lists of legions stationed across the empire, normally kept with absolute precision, no longer mention them. Their name vanished from inscriptions, official documents, and imperial records. Even coins and military annals, sources that recorded even the smallest victories, made no reference to the Ninth Legion. It was as if a giant eraser had been taken to the very fabric of the empire. For over a century, historians tried to explain this silence with a single terrifying theory. They believed that sometime around 117 AD, the Ninth Legion marched north into Scotland to crush a rebellion. And there, deep in the misty highlands, they were completely annihilated by tribal warriors. According to the legend, the entire legion was wiped out in a catastrophic and overwhelming defeat. The loss of an entire elite legion would have been a devastating blow to Roman power and prestige. For the newly crowned Emperor Hadrian, such a disaster could have shaken the very foundation of his rule. Admitting that a group of tribal warriors had completely destroyed one of Rome's finest legions would have shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. So according to the theory, the empire chose to bury the truth. They erased the legion from history and silenced any record of its existence. And instead of sending more armies north, Hadrian gave a very different order. He ordered his men to stop advancing and start building. Across the northern frontier of Britain, a massive stone barrier began to rise. 73 miles of stone stretching across the land, what we now know as Hadrian's Wall. To many, it was a symbol of Roman strength and control. But through the lens of the lost Ninth Legion, it told a very different story. It was not a symbol of power. It was a line of fear, a barrier built to keep something out, something that had already destroyed an entire legion. For decades, this chilling story became accepted as historical truth. But there was one major problem with this terrifying legend. Modern archaeology would eventually prove that it was almost entirely wrong. The truth was not buried in the cold fog of Scotland. It was hiding hundreds of miles away, deep in mainland Europe. At an ancient Roman site in the Netherlands, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. Stamped into baked clay tiles were the unmistakable marks of the Ninth Legion. The inscription read, Leg 9 Hispana, the official name of the legion itself. But it wasn't just the name that shocked researchers. It was the date. These tiles were carefully dated to between 120 and 130 AD. This created a massive contradiction in the story everyone believed. Because if the Ninth Legion had been destroyed in Scotland around 117 AD, then they could not have been building and stamping materials in the Netherlands years later. The timeline simply didn't make sense. And the evidence didn't stop there. Archaeologists also uncovered a bronze pendant linked directly to the Legion. Piece by piece, the physical evidence began to reveal a completely different story. But the most decisive evidence didn't come from artifacts. It came from the Roman records themselves. Historians discovered the name of a high-ranking officer from the Ninth Legion, Lucius Aemilius Carus. His career was well documented across multiple official Roman records, and according to those records, he was still alive decades after the legion supposedly vanished. In fact, by the Horn 40s AD, he had risen to become a governor in the eastern provinces of the empire. This meant that the commanders of the Ninth Legion had not died in some catastrophic massacre. They had survived and even been promoted. When combined with the archaeological discoveries in the Netherlands, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Ninth Legion had not been destroyed in Britain. They had been quietly transferred out of the region. They were reassigned to the European mainland, likely to reinforce vulnerable frontiers. This aligned perfectly with the strategy of Emperor Hadrian. He was shifting the empire away from reckless expansion and toward heavily fortified defensive borders. The wall in Britain was not built out of fear of a massacre. It was part of a calculated, empire-wide military reorganization. The Ninth Legion was simply repositioned to where it was needed most. Far from being destroyed, they were still serving the empire. Still fighting, still building, still alive. But this only deepened the mystery. The answer to the final mystery lies far from Britain, in the distant eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. In 1302 AD, a brutal and devastating conflict erupted. The Bar Kokhba revolt. This was no ordinary rebellion. It was one of the bloodiest wars Rome had ever faced. Entire legions were pushed to their limits, suffering staggering and relentless casualties. Roman historians later described losses so severe that they broke tradition when reporting them. Even Emperor Hadrian avoided declaring that the legions were in good health. And just decades later, another massive war erupted, this time against the powerful Parthian Empire. These eastern wars were catastrophic, pushing Roman forces into devastating and overwhelming defeats. Some legions were shattered beyond recovery. Units that had once stood as symbols of Roman strength simply ceased to exist. And it is here, in these distant and brutal conflicts, that historians believe the Ninth Legion met its true fate. Not in the cold fog of Scotland, but under the burning sun of the East. The Legion likely suffered catastrophic losses so severe that it could no longer function as a military unit. And when that happened, Rome did not honor its failure, it erased it. The Legion's name and number were quietly retired, removed from official records forever. Not cursed, not remembered, simply forgotten. For centuries, people imagined a ghost army lost in the mists of Scotland. But the truth is far more human. They were soldiers sent from one brutal frontier to another until the Empire finally sent them into a war they could not survive. Their remains are not hidden in the fog of Scotland. They are scattered beneath the sands of the Middle East, victims of an empire that demanded everything and erased them when they failed. The legend of the lost Ninth Legion may have captivated the world, but modern archaeology has revealed a far deeper truth. History is not always what it seems, and sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones we think we already understand. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore more hidden truths of history.